Poison Pokemon are some of the worst Pokemon that you could ever use in competitive. However, are there any that are actually really good? In today's video, I want to answer just that. What are the best Poison-type Pokemon that you can use in competitive? So we're going to be ranking all of them for you guys to see. If you guys enjoy this type of content and you want to see some more like it, of course, like and subscribe and answer the comment question of the day. What is your favorite Poison-type Pokemon to use in competitive this generation? My personal favorite is probably Iron Moth right now. However, there are a lot of really cool ones coming through Pokemon Home, such as Sneasler and Overquill, that I am very much looking forward to trying for the first time this generation. With that said though, let's quickly break down what our tierings that we're going to be using for today's tier list are going to be. Starting off with the S plus tier. With the S plus tier, this is going to be getting into Pokemon, for example, like your Fluttermanes or your Larastherians, where these are so important to your team that you would genuinely be handicapping yourself even just using another S tier for this slot. The S tiers are going to be for Pokemon that are still fairly meta defining. These are going to be, as I said, like the Garchomps, where they're still really important and they're still Pokemon that you should expect to see on a majority of teams because the meta does kind of revolve around their presence. Or maybe if not Garchomp necessarily, something like a Roaring Moon. Roaring Moon's another great example of this, where it does have enough of an impact where you genuinely need to respect its presence. The A tiers are going to be for Pokemon. These are like the 5th and 6th slots on teams. You'll still see these in most given ladder sections, at least probably on a good amount of teams, and you should know at least how you're going to beat these Pokemon and at least have a check, if not an outright counter to these on every team. The B tiers are going to be for Pokemon that you don't necessarily need to check to, but you at least should start planning how you're going to beat these. For example, if I put Pelipper in the B tier, while I don't need to have a Pelipper check, I should know how I'm beating Rain by proxy because of Pelipper's existence. Going to the C tiers, these are more so niche picks. These might counter a specific S tier or help at least check a good amount of them, but you're not really going to see these on more than maybe a couple teams here and there. Maybe you will probably go several ladder sessions without seeing them, but you might see it. The D tiers are going to be for YouTuber picks. These are things that I might use, for example, to clickbait with, but you wouldn't necessarily see these on any viable team. The only exception would be if I said a Pokemon's broken and therefore it's objective fact. The F tiers are going to be for Pokemon though that are so bad that even I wouldn't typically touch these, even if the team was meant to be a gimmicky one. So with that said, let's get started with Venomoth. Now, Venomoth is a kind of interesting one. Venomoth, at the very least, is going to probably... I feel like Venomoth kind of sits around the D tier. I think it's definitely a YouTuber pick. This mon, at the very least, Venomoth has some benefit with Tinted Lens, and the base 90 speed is okay with support moves like Rage Powder and Tailwind. You could kind of make Venomoth work, but its stats are so abhorrent that it really just won't hold up. I think it's one of those unfortunate Pokemon that just kind of got screwed over by the fact that we've evolved a lot since Venomoth was introduced. And even with the introduction of Tinted Lens as a hidden ability, sadly, it's just gotten overlooked. Galar Slowbro. This one's definitely, I think, worse than Venomoth at least. However, this isn't one of the F tiers I was talking about necessarily. Galar Slowbro, at the very least, is an okay option. And with stuff like Quick Draw plus Quick Claw, you could stack these in tandem and get at least a kind of fast option in Trick Room that could also be kind of fast outside of Trick Room if you pop one of the two abilities. It has also Regenerator, which is decent, but I don't think his Pokemon is bulky enough to make it work. And with the offenses of 100 in both stats, while it's kind of viable, at the same time though, it's not really a viable offensive Pokemon either. It's just kind of okay that you have it in both stats at least, and that is a benefit this Pokemon has because you can, technically speaking, make a lot of different stuff work. And especially with your signature move being Shell Sidearm, at the very least this does work sort of like a Photon Geyser, where you can smart adapt it to attack physically or specially. And with physical, you have a chance to, I believe it's for like a poison as well through contact. I forget what the exact things are, but the effect does change based on if it's physical or special, which is pretty cool. And the fact that it does smart adapt even after your stat boosts or drops is pretty important here, because you could invest this physically, but then have also a special attack here for the poison side in case if your opponent has a good Intimidate mon. So I do think with that sort of gimmick, at the very least, this is a D tier. Next up, Muck. Muck honestly also can get a D tier, but this one's probably gonna get like the very bottom of D tier. This actually... No, never mind. Muck will get the top of F tier. Muck has a couple things going for it with stuff like Minimize, for example, and the fact that it is a very spit F bulky poison. However, in doubles, truthfully, I just don't think a Muck has the longevity to actually support itself. And with the meta being so physically leaning right now, while this is a kind of good check to Fluttermane, the coverage option that Fluttermane would use for this, one, has risen a lot because of Glimmora, but two, it's Psyshock, which doesn't really care about Muck's Phys Def stat, and because of the fact that, well, special defense stat, I should say. And with Muck being such a specially defensive leaning Pokemon, sadly, that's kind of unfortunate for it. Now, if Fluttermane lacked Psyshock and maybe what for like a Psychic instead, Muck might have a little bit more of an argument, and it might even be able to use like a Terra Fire or something to get around that. But ultimately though, I don't think a Muck is that important in this format. It's an F tier. Alolan Muck, Alolan Muck, however, is going to get the B tier. Now, sadly, I did learn the other day that Alolan Muck might not get every sort of move that I thought it would under the sun. For example, Alolan Muck actually misses out on Curse, which is really bad for it, actually. That's so bad for it. So when I was doing my Dark tier list, I did also put Alolan Muck in the B tier, and I do think a Curse is enough of a nerf for this to where that does hurt a bit. However, I think at the same time, with the Poison ceiling, it's more so like the bottom of the B tier for Dark. But for Poison, it's probably going to be still one of the best ones. Even without Curse, I think that Curse would have been a nice option for Close Sheet, and I think this would have helped a lot with Close Sheet play. However, I still think that in Open Sheet, one of the best sets you can run with Alolan Muck will be the Assault Vest set. Moving on to Gengar. Now, Gengar, I think I've fallen off a little bit in opinion of, but I still think I'm going to give this thing a C tier. Gengar is a little bit underwhelming this generation, and I think it's only going to continue to become more underwhelming. However, the 110 speed and the utility this thing does provide, I'd be lying if I said this thing didn't have some benefits. For one, it's a ghost type that can also match up well in the Flutter Mane, so if you're running this thing on Tailwind, and you do end up investing this thing to creep like a booster max speed timid Flutter Mane, which I know is not exactly too common right now, but with Pokemon like Gengar, you can't really afford to go slower, you could at least handle opposing Flutter Mane that are not running on Tailwind teams, and that's a decent benefit that you have. Not only this, but you also do have the benefit of stuff like Imprison plus Trick Room to get around Trick Room teams, which could actually, again, be a nice benefit for Gengar and Tailwind. So I think that Gengar does have a little bit of merit here. Also with stuff like Haze on Gengar, it's really good roll compression for certain Tailwind mons, like if you're running this with Talonflame, for example, because you could run Perish Song or Haze and get around opposing teams that way. But at the same time, I do think that this thing is kind of just like a shitty mix of like Murkrow and Fluttermane, and that's okay for it. It has the stats to kind of make it work. It's just underwhelming in comparison to how good Fluttermane is, so I'm going to give it the C tier. Galar Slowking. Galar Slowking can also get a D tier. Just like with Galar Slowbro, at the very least, this thing is kind of underwhelming. However, one benefit this does have over... Well, actually, this thing has two benefits that are pretty cool. One is the addition of Chilly Reception, which... Unlike last generation, Galar Slowking now does have a way to actually switch out and take advantage of this regenerator, which is kind of cool. At the same time, though, we haven't really seen that be useful on Slowking this generation to begin with, but Galar Slowking does have at least a little bit better of a typing, and it also has a slightly better stat line. With 10 base higher and special attack, that actually is a pretty big deal because it's taking out of just the physical attack stat, which Slowking was never using to begin with anyway, outside of, I guess, like gimmicky belly drum sets. But the poison psychic typing, this does give you a lot of good advantages. Being able to be immune to toxic spikes is pretty cool. And I say the toxic spikes, I know it's not a huge deal, but with Glimmora being a decent presence with stuff like Dozo teams, this could be a decent way for Trick Room to use Chilly Reception, pivot in and out through like a backseat mon such as King Gambit, and then switch in and clear the T-Spikes, which you would maybe be able to set yourself by killing Glimmora with King Gambit. So it's just like a small example, of course, of where that might become a benefit. But there are a lot of cases where I think a Galar Slowking could be a decent enough Trick Room option. Actually, I'm going to give this thing a C tier. This thing can at least get the bottom of C tier. The bulk is good enough alone, and I think this thing could lean into that Spidef and maybe go with like a Terra Grass set yet again. Quillfish. Quillfish, sadly, this thing is going to get like the top of D tier. Meanwhile, as far as the Sui and Quillfish goes, this thing can actually get a C tier, and I'm putting this at the top of C tier. Sui and Quillfish does have a nice benefit, being the fact that it can hold a Violate, which holds a couple key advantages here. One, with the Sui and Quillfish, you only have one weakness to work with regular Quillfish, you have several. Two, the fact that you're using it a Violate, it's a lot less competitive of an item slot. And three, since these both basically have the same stat line, you're getting one Pokemon that essentially can have a better typing than Quillfish, on top of the fact that you also have, despite having the exact same stats, the ability to boost your physical and special defense by 1.5 stage. And unlike Quillfish, you could still do that without having to give up the ability to use status moves. And I say that if you were to try and throw on like an Assault Vest Quillfish on a regular Quillfish, just to get the 1.5 and Spidef, which in theory you can do, but you can't run moves like Taunt, which are actually pretty important to Quillfish's moveset. Stuff like Taunt and Haze are kind of the reason you would run this over other Intimidating mons. So I do think that Hisui and Quillfish will actually have a bit of a presence in the metagame. But you can make this into kind of like a shitty Glimmora with like Toxic Spikes, Taunt, Haze, and then probably something like a Gunk Shot or maybe like a Poison Jab could be decent. Or even maybe like a Terra Water Aqua Jet set could be kind of good here. But overall, I do think this one will actually be kind of good in this format. And I think that Hisui and Quillfish will definitely get the top of C tier. Hisui and Sneasel, this one I think I gave like a C tier on fighting or maybe a D tier. I'm giving it a D tier now though. I don't really care what I gave it then. Hisui and Sneasel is kind of bad. This thing really, its best stat is the 115, but coming from that video, I've realized that 115 speed stat is actually really slow in this format. But comparing Generation 8 or 7 Pokemon that were like a base 90 speed, it's pretty comparable to how Hisui and Sneasel at 115 feels in this current format. So I'm going to give this thing a D tier. I think it deserves truthfully like the bottom of D tier. So while it sucks, I'm not going to give this thing the time of day. You guys can use your imaginations to think of why I would put this thing in the F tier. It sucks. It's just a worse muck. Seviper, this thing can get right above Swalot. I will go into this one a little bit. Seviper obviously has pretty terrible stats. It has the Slowbro Galar syndrome of 100-100 for offenses, which is also pretty shit. But Seviper does have one key benefit here, and that's the fact that you do have, actually it has two key benefits. One is the ability Infiltrator, which does allow you to get past sub-Pokemon, and this could actually have some merit here. I think Seviper, if nothing else, if you were to throw this thing on like a Scarf set or maybe on like a Room Service Trick Room build, could maybe have some merit actually at being a decent Pokemon with moves like Glare, for example, which Glare is pretty important. Now, if Seviper kept toxic, I might actually consider putting this thing in the D tier, because you could use this thing with like a Terra Grass set and get around potential Dundozos with Substitute, and just go for a toxic through Substitute with that. However, with moves like Haze still in your backseat, and even Switcheroo, you could actually maybe make this thing to a decent Trick Scarfer. Moving on to Skuntank though, this thing is going to be the very top of, actually no, we're going to put this thing in the D tier. I do still like this thing in the D tier. We'll put it right below Quillfish. So with Skuntank in the D tier, this thing has a couple of key benefits. For one, similarly to the Quillfish line, this thing does get Haze, which is pretty cool. And you also have a little bit more offenses than Hisui and Quillfish would have, which is pretty important. Actually, never mind, you have slightly less. Damn, this mod fucking sucks. Kurt, you were right when you called that thing shit in Generation 8. This thing sucks. With stuff like Haze, Sucker Punch, Taunt, Toxic Place, I mean, honestly, that's kind of a decent benefit here over even stuff like Seviper. But I'm going to lower this thing's ranking a little bit because in hindsight, this thing has just no reason being ran over Quillfish. I guess this thing can at least get like above Galar Slowbro, but I don't know. Venomoth at least has a unique role, so we're going to give it above Venomoth. But yeah, this thing is just not great. The typing is what carries it, truthfully. But this thing is just shitty Hisui and Quillfish with a much better HP stat, but that won't even matter because Hisui and Quillfish can carry a Violet. So, yeah. Toxicroak. Toxicroak can get a C tier. I forget where I put this thing. I might even put this thing in like the D tier, but I've come around to Toxicroak a little bit. I think that Toxicroak, weirdly enough, has enough niche options in its moveset, with a lot of well-rounded coverage with moves like Bullet Punch, as well as stuff like Vacuum Wave and Nasty Plot and Sword Dance sets. You do also have stuff like Sucker Punch. You have a lot of well-rounded coverage, and you could definitely make good use of Terra Blast. You do still have a nice way to get around Iron Bundle with this because of the Vacuum Wave, which is pretty important. And you also could even run this thing with like a mix set with like Sucker Punch as well to get around Terra Ghost builds. So I still am going to stand by the fact that Toxicroak is a bottom of C tier option. I think it's one of those things that gets a lot better when we do get stuff like Rain as a really viable playstyle, because it's kind of a decent option to check common rain threats like grasses, for example. Moving on, we have Arceus Poison. This thing gets an S tier. Arceus Poison has a really good benefit in singles, and if this was a singles tier list, I would consider maybe putting this thing in the S plus as like a bottom of S plus, because I do think that with Terra, that Arceus Poison will actually be a kind of good option, because you do have the option to use this thing as a really good toxic immunity. And when your opponent has no longer any ways to actually poison you, you could Terra into any type that is better than this, because poison as the only benefit is the fact that you cannot get poisoned, which is pretty good. However, that's really only a good benefit in singles. If this was a singles tier list, I would actually consider giving it S plus off of that alone, because I think it's actually a huge fucking niche this Pokemon has. However, in VGC, this is probably one of the worst options you could run for an Arceus type, because of the fact that VGC doesn't really care much about poison. On top of that as well, this thing doesn't really benefit a lot from even being a Flutter Mane check, because there's just a lot of better options to do that. I would argue that most steals will do the role better. Hell, I would argue that even most steals in lower tiers than Arceus would do the job better. But Arceus Poison stats are so good, and also the fact that you can Terra and be really nuanced with your Terra into something like a Grass, for example. I think a lot of poisons do benefit from Terra Grass for what it's worth, or even like a Terra Water or Fire. Could all be better options, but yeah, this thing is kind of okay. It's a really badass tier, but at the same time, it's an Arceus. I can't put it lower. Amoonguss, S+. This thing is one of the best Pokemon for VGC ever created. I think it does deserve the discussion with Pokemon like Incineroar, Landorus, Therian, etc. And we've only continued to see that in this generation. And Amoonguss has never once had a bad gen, to be honest. In Generation 5, this thing was top tier. Generation 6, I'm pretty sure this thing was pretty common with stuff like, even despite Pokemon like Heatran and Mega Gardevoir being common, I remember seeing Amoonguss played a lot. Generation 7, I know this thing was played. at least in formats where it was allowed. I don't think it was a thing in first series. But at the very least in like 18, 19, I know this thing got play. In Generation 8, this thing was really fucking good when it was illegal. And yeah, I mean, Amoonguss literally, it's never been a bad Pokemon. Amoonguss with stuff like Regen and Spore. Spore is 100% accurate, and with Regen, you can make this thing really bulky. And this is probably the best generation that Amoonguss has ever had, I would argue, since maybe, I can't speak on Generation 5, and I can't speak on earlier formats in 6. But at the very least, since like 2016, I would argue this is the best format that Amoonguss has ever had. With the ability to check Flutter Mane immensely, as well as the fact that this is an incredible option to take advantage of Terra. Because as I mentioned earlier, you do not like keeping that poison typing. Amoonguss, though, is so bulky and it has such a perfect support kit with stuff like Pollen Puff, Regenerator, Spore, Rage Powder, that doesn't really matter. This thing could have the worst typing in the world. It could have like a poison ice typing for all I care. And it would probably still find a way to be at least like an A tier or a B tier Pokemon. But however, with the options that it does have, and that grass typing being great to get around powder options, it only helps a lot more. Because now if an opposing Rage Powder grass type was to try and draw you in, you no longer have the ability to actually spore that as long as you don't Terra. And if your opponent doesn't have a means of doing so, you can just Terra into something like a Terra Fire, which helps a lot with your Torkoal Trigger matchup, Terra Water, which also does the same thing, but it doesn't keep your Fairy resistance, which is a little bit different, but still decent because on teams that are really ground weak, Terra Water is pretty valuable. You have Terra Dark, which is great for size spam matchups. This was really big in Series 2, at least in open sheet format, where tournament play saw a lot of Terra Dark Amoonguss to try and mimic the Bonnet potential, but still keep Amoonguss's better options with slower speed stat, for example, and just the fact that you weren't having 4 move slot syndrome there. You also have the ability to use Terra Normal, which was pretty decent actually for Flutter Mane, because typically a lot of people would be trying to go for Shadow Ball, and you could instead go for Terra Normal and then be immune to Shadow Ball and then put Flutter Mane to sleep that way, which is pretty cool. You have stuff like Terra Electric, which I think is mostly just for a flying check. I saw this on a couple teams when going through Serraledge builds for the Serraledge members video, which shameless plug for that. Point being, there are so many fucking good Terra types in this thing. Truthfully, I can make a whole video on Amoonguss, and I'm actually pulling that in the next members video poll, because I think that it is that good of a Pokemon that I could do a whole fucking hour talking about Amoonguss if I really wanted to. But this thing is so fucking incredible. It's one of the best VGC Pokemon of all time. I would argue it's in like the top 5. But that's a whole different list for another day. For now, S+. Dragalge. Dragalge is pretty interesting, actually. This thing, unlike a lot of the C tiers, has proven viability this gen. This thing was pretty good. Well, it was okay in Series 2. I don't want to overstate this thing, but it's an okay enough option in Series 2 to where I do think that Dragalge, at the very least, is worth mentioning here. It's a cool trigger threat on Poison. It's a good offensive T-Spiker. It also has stuff like Haze in its kit, which is pretty important for such a good offensive threat. On top of this as well, when you're taking this thing's toolkit and you're comparing it into slots like Dondozo, which you could then Terra Grass to get around. However, that does hurt a bit with adaptability, but you could also go for like a Terra Dragon and be fine there. Terra Grass to Terra Blast though still works here, or even Terra Electric. Point being is that you do have a lot in your kit with like adaptability to make it really valuable as an offensive threat. And with Terra, you could turn into another type, get stab off of that, plus adaptability boost, and go even further. But Dragalge has a nice benefit though of just spamming Draco into Dondozo and just never needing to worry about the fact that you'll drop your own special attack there, which is pretty fucking good. Toxapex. Toxapex can also get a C tier actually. I think that initially I was thinking, oh, you know, I'd put this in the D tier, but no, this thing actually can get a C tier. Toxapex has a lot of really good niche support, and when we're talking about a types tier list specifically, Toxapex is worth mentioning here. With stuff like, for example, you have Haze, Toxic Spikes, and the regen ability, and also support like Wide Guard, you can actually start to see why this thing could become a kind of viable threat. Because pre-Terra, you have the ability Wide Guard, which, well, the move Wide Guard, which can start blocking Expanding Force from size spam. On top of the fact that as well, without the Terra, you are now resisting stuff like Armor Cannon, and that does put you up pretty high above the list from other Wide Guard Pokemon. The only one that really rivals this is Garganacl, but Garganacl does have a lot of moves that it does want to run, and while Wide Guard typically is on those movesets, some teams might just benefit from running something else. To suck up T-Spikes, which could be valuable for bulky Pokemon, and also the regen ability, which benefits off of switching in general, Toxapex at least deserves a C tier in this format. Salazzle also gets a C tier. This one might be a bit biased, but I'm actually going to put Salazzle in the very high end of C tier. Now, I do think this thing has a little bit of benefit over something like a Gengar, and I think it's the fact that its support is a little bit more unique. With Corrosion, for example, you can poison a lot of Pokemon that would otherwise maybe have that immunity, or with the Oblivious ability, you're immune to stuff like Taunt, which is pretty valuable when we get into one of the best sets for this Pokemon. Now, I highly recommend a Terrago set with Focus Sash if you're going to run this, with the Oblivious ability and going for moves like Fake Out, Encore, Disable, and then probably, well, you could go with Encore or Disable, or you can go with both. And then you have options like T-Spikes, Overheat, etc. And you can make this into a pretty big threat. When I personally actually consider this for Charlotte Regionals, I consider this thing with Fake Out, Disable. I went with Toxic Spikes and Overheat, though I did quickly change Toxic Spikes to Encore and just threw on Encore and Disable. And you can honestly get a lot of mileage at this Pokemon. It's something I really want to try on the channel again. I did intend to actually show a video with this in Series 2. However, I ended up foregoing this because the only team that I ran it on was so similar to the Charlotte team I covered that I didn't really want to do a whole separate showcase for Salazzle. But it is something I do want to show in the future. Really good Pokemon, objective C tier. Moving on, we have Toxtricity. This thing is a pretty interesting one. I forget where I put this with Electric, but I think my opinion on this has changed a little bit. We're going to give this thing a B tier. With Terra Normal plus the ability to go for stuff like Throw Spike Boom Burst, this is a pretty decent partner when paired next to something like a Flutter Mane. However, at the same time, though, I do think that Toxtricity is a little bit niche. You need this thing basically on Tailwind. Though it is a pretty destructive breaker when supported right, you do just need to really kind of dedicate your team to Toxtricity sweeping for it to be good. But I think it's good enough to where it's at least a bottom of B tier. Like when I'm looking at these C tiers, I don't think it's as niche as Pokemon like Salazzle, Dragalge, Gengar, etc. Because Toxtricity can at least do some damage, and it can do it pretty consistently if you're building your team really dedicated to doing so. But you do kind of need to do so. It's borderline a top of C, bottom of B tier. But I do think it's better enough than a lot of the C's. In turn of this, I'm actually going to give the A tier. This is, as I said earlier, I was hinting at it pretty heavily. We have a lot of restricteds that might not necessarily deserve that S tier, and I do think a turn of this is sadly one of them. 130 speed is pretty slow in this format. With Recover being nerfed as well, this does hurt. However, it's not as bad in VGC by a mile, considering how much this thing doesn't really care about just going for Recover stall sets. One of the biggest reasons that this thing does get the A tier is going to be because of Meteor Beam. Checking back, I actually gave this thing a B tier, so I was actually even more unkind to this thing, to be completely honest. But I do think that the 130 speed is still pretty decent. This thing meets the mileage as at least a kind of fast option. And you do get stuff like agility, which could be kind of cool. However, one of the biggest things against my reason for putting this thing in the S tier is the loss of Meteor Beam, which was objectively one of the best reasons to run this Pokemon. You'd be able to run this thing with like a Power Herb set with like Power Herb, Recover, Mystical Fire, and Power Herb, and you go like Mystical Fire, Recover, Meteor Beam, and like Sludge Wave, and you could actually make this thing to a pretty decent Pokemon. However, sadly, this thing is now just a Pokemon that's going to kind of just sit on the field and exist. You do get Dragon Dance now, which is pretty cool, but compared to its 145 special attack, you only have 85 physical. So it's kind of at the point where just why bother running this thing over another Dragon Dance restricted option. Sneasler is also going to get the A tier. This thing is kind of a cool option, and I think unlike Hawlucha, this might have some benefit on a Side Spam team with Unburden. For one, this thing actually is slightly faster than Hawlucha with the 120 speed versus 118. On top of this as well, you get options like Fake Out, which is pretty decent, and you could do this with like a normal jump Fake Out set, or even just something like an Unburden Psychic Seed set could be pretty decent for this Pokemon. With Terrestrial as well, this thing could be kind of a decent option by going for a typing that's not poison or fighting. I would personally recommend Dark a lot in this Pokemon. I think it would actually be really amazing with Terra Dark, and going for something like a Night Slash Scope Lens set could also be pretty good with the Poison Touch, and you can go for like Poison Jab, Night Slash, and then go for fillers and just try and sweep through teams that way. I think this thing has enough going for it to where it will be a kind of okay offensive threat on Tailwind. I don't think it's going to be great or anything, but I think it's good enough to at least be better than Eternatus. It's at least more consistent in my opinion than the B tiers. Overquill, I think I'm still going to stand by the fact this is just a slightly worse Hisui and Quillfish. However, at the same time, this thing does have a lot of good benefit on Brain. I think you could maybe make this thing work as a good like grass check if any grasses that are not Amoonguss pop up in the format that are actually really viable, because this thing could be a decent option to check those. And with like a Terra Grass set, you could make this thing into a decent rain option, or Terra Water as well could take advantage of options like Aqua Tail and just start snowballing teams that way. In Close Sheet, I think this thing will have the biggest benefit, truthfully. I think that Overquill being a good Close Sheet Pokemon will actually take off, because on Close Sheet you can throw this thing on a rain team, and it's ambiguous whether you would run this thing as a Swiss Home option for rain and try and sweep a team late game, or if you're running this thing as an Intimidate option for rain and gonna try and lead it to set up something else to sweep. And I think that both options do have a lot of merit here, and I think it's specifically because of the Close Sheet potential, this thing does, in my eyes, still sit in the C tier. I think it's pretty equal with Quillfish. I think beforehand I would have put Quillfish as a higher slot, and I even put it 2 Pokemon higher when I did my Dark tier list. However, for this format, I think they're pretty even. I'm going to lean Quillfish though, because I think its ability to have the uncompetitive item slot is slightly better than Overquill. Moving into Revivroom, this thing is kind of niche. This is definitely the epitome of the YouTuber Pokemon this generation for Poison. We're putting this thing at the top of D tier. actually. And I think it's because of the fact that this thing is kind of unique, and with filter, this thing could actually make kind of a presence here. We've seen shift gear sets with like random Terra, like fire, for example, pop up on, again, like YouTuber teams, keep in mind, but it's something. You could also use overcoat to get a spore immunity, which is kind of cool, but I think that filter is probably going to be the better option unless you're going for defensive Terra here. Objectively though, Revivoom is just kind of an okay option. The steel poison typing pre-Terra is so shit though, having a 4x weakness to ground and having a lot of other weaknesses to types like fire. Actually, this thing doesn't have a lot of weaknesses, but the 4x to ground being one of the best offensive types in the game is really bad for it. So we're going to give it a top of D tier. Moving to Glimmora. This is also a 4x weak ground Pokemon, but I'm giving this thing the S tier. I think that Glimmora has proven itself as a really good Tailwind threat this generation, and it's also really good at setting up T-Spikes for opposing stall matchups. It's also really good next to stuff like Rochian and Dondozo, because of those stall teams benefiting from having the option to beat stall mirrors. And I think it's really good, and it's found its way outside of just stall playstyles. I think when we did, even back when I did the dark tier list, I know it's not relevant to Glimmora at all, but around the timeline I was thinking, man, Glimmora kind of sucks. It's like an okay option, it's like a good B tier threat, but honestly it's proven itself all generation, and I'm really glad that Poison waited until this long to do so, because I would have not done Glimmora justice if we did this tier list like a month or two ago, or even 3. So Glimmora can honestly get an easy S tier. This is an incredible threat, and I do highly recommend anyone using this thing. Grafia is pretty good. We're gonna give this thing a C tier. I'm putting it right above Salazzle. I do think that the Quillfish line for Hisuian forms will be slightly better, but at the same time though, this thing has some good support stuff like Doodle, and it's Prankster alone, which honestly Prankster really just put this thing up. There's a lot of really shit C tier poisons, and I do think that that alone, just having such an uncompetitive slot for poison typing is pretty good. You're also a normal type that has no fighting weakness, so it's really just the poison weakness of stuff like ground, psychic, etc. And with stuff like the poison touch as well, it's kind of okay, but really poison touch and Unburden, despite being okay abilities, are so shit compared to Prankster for this Pokemon. Actually, Unburden's kind of okay, but the point being is just, this thing is kind of outclassed by the Prankster mons, it's kind of outclassed by the Unburden mons, but it has the, I guess, the 50-50 of both. Really, you're running this thing for Prankster Doodle though, and that's about it. C tier. Iron Moth gets an S tier. This thing is objectively better than Arceus Poison, at least. With booster energy speed, this is actually like this is what I would consider like the first fast Pokemon in any given like checklist for speed. It really, there's not any viable Scarfers that really do reach that epitome of just being up in this fast echelon. It's like Iron Moth, Iron Valiant, which is still kind of shit, Fluttermane, Roaring Moon, Iron Bundle, in no particular order. Like, those are the fast Pokemon. Anything else is a decently okay at speed Pokemon. I guess Talonflame also can get there just because of Gale Wings plus the Brave Bird as a guaranteed option, and also just being a good fast enabler. But we're really like, there's not a lot of fast threats. I would say this is the last line for like a fast threat. Maybe Jugulis if we're gonna be kind to it, or like Walking Wake by proxy because of Jugulis being slightly slower. But this thing, point being, is definitely a fast enough Pokemon, and with spreads like Heat Wave and Sludge Wave, this is pretty decent. Really, the biggest gripe about putting this thing any lower than, well, any higher than Glimmora, the one thing that stops it is the fact that Iron Moth sadly doesn't have a great poison option that is a single target. If we look into poison type options, it has Sludge Wave, which is great. Venoshock is the best poison option that it has though, for damage at least, and that's only 65. And then Acid Spray meanwhile is 40, but that can at least kind of rack up in succession, which is kind of a good trade-off there. We're gonna give this thing an S tier though. It still is pretty decent. Just if this thing had Sludge Bomb, I would probably put it like top of S tier. For context, it would never hit the S+ though. Finally, Clodsire. This thing can get a D tier. We're putting this at least above like Skuntank. With the unaware sets, you could maybe make this thing into like a soft dozo check. That's probably the best thing I could say about this mon, but objectively though, it's just kind of outclassed. That's gonna be our tier list for today though, and if you enjoyed and you want to see some more content like this, of course, like and subscribe and answer the comment question of the day, being what is your favorite poison type to use in competitive. Shout out to Kurt for editing this as always. Make sure to check him out. His links are in the description below. Phenomenal content creator, and really just one of the best people that I personally know at creating content on the format. So make sure, of course, that you check him out. He does a lot of singles and doubles. Shout out to our channel members, of course, as always, being Josh, aka Ultra Player, Mia, Zeke Zero, Bbat, Anna Purr, Timo Mueller, Fonzie, Bam Bambi, Rao Plays, Obo, and Johannes B. Your support is greatly appreciated. And if you want to see some more content like this, of course, and get some bonus behind the scenes for both mon in-depth analysis, like the Dragalge video we just recently published that was also edited by Kurt, or our run to Master Ball with our Paradox and present day Pokemon team, make sure you guys subscribe for the channel membership. It's only a couple dollars a month, and you get 2 bonus videos a month. With that said, I will see you guys on Monday for our next video. Until then, peace out, guys.